Hello and welcome to another edition of Storyophonic, a regular conversation series with tips and tales from deep inside the music industry. Please take a moment and rate us or give us a review on your favorite podcast platform. You can follow us at storyophonic.com as well as on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Now let's meet the host of Storyophonic, Dan Campbell.
A producer, engineer, mixer, composer, and player. Irish-born, Liverpool-educated, Los Angeles transplant Lynne Earls credits include Katie Lang, Calexico, Rumer, Lizz Wright, Wayne Shorter, and many others.
I'm starting to understand what it is that moves me and what I feel makes great music, and that's what I'm gravitating towards. And for somebody else it might be different, and there will be an audience for that different thing that they do. There's no competition. It's more like, okay, I'm just going to try to be the best of what I can do and really try to show up and be present in whatever project I'm working on.
She compares recording to photography, and with instinct and intuition as her guides, her goal is to catch the optimal sonic light in the perfect moment. Let's join Lynne Earls as she shares the creative alchemy and the sheer magic of making music. So we're in studio with Lynne Earls. So good to see you.
So good to see you.
We've been looking forward to having you come in here and do this with us.
Me too.
For a long time. So we have a lot to talk about, Lynne Earls. First off, let's start in the present. You're very active right now in a number of organizations, not the least of which is NARAS. Can you tell us a little bit about your commitment to that organization and kind of some of the things that you're doing?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been my great pleasure this past year to be a governor on the board of the LA chapter of the Recording Academy. And it's just been such an eye-opener. I had no idea really what NARAS did and what the Recording Academy does. And it's such a great excitement to me now to meet peers and friends and go, but you've no idea what they do. It's so amazing. There's the producer and engineer wing, there's music cares, there's the advocacy, there's Grammy Next and Grammy U to kind of bring forward the young members and potential young members coming up through the industry. And it's so exciting to just get to look behind the curtain and see that we think of the Grammys as the award show, but the Recording Academy, spends the entire year working on very important issues that affect us as a community of music creators. So I feel really lucky to be able to get to know what they do and to be able to serve and be a part of that. And they're so open to our voice. I feel like it is way more community driven than anybody realizes, where they're looking to us as elected members as what's on your mind, what do you feel like people are struggling with, where are the solutions, what can we do? And so it's been just amazing to get to know that that's what's actually going on. So I encourage everyone to check out, spend a little time checking out what they do, because I feel like most of us don't realize.
In the thoughts of community, this is a wonderful time, and our podcast has been reflecting women in positions where historically we have not had women in terms of production, engineering, and mastering, and label heads. So that is a wonderful evolution that we're seeing now. And of course, you are a part of that as well.
It's been very interesting to see, because I've been in LA and working in the industry for 20 years, and it wasn't really it was a topic within individual sessions where people would maybe comment, oh, I've never really worked with a female engineer before. And you would have a short conversation about it. But now I feel like there's a tidal wave of activity and organizations kind of coming together to support women in audio and really offer, mentorship and kind of help encourage people to do what they love without, kind of some of the thinking too much about the obstacles of the numbers being kind of wildly off.
It's an evolution, and I have an educational background, as you know, and we'll talk about our mutual connection there. But I note now when I see bands with women bass players, women drummers, in mixed male-female bands, it always makes those bands look so much more modern, to see that.
Well, it feels more like natural life to have a balance of different people working on in whatever field it is. But it's been so amazing to see these, there's She Is the Music, which was set up by the head of UMG, Jodie Kirsten, and kind of headed up by Kristen Smith, and Alicia Keys has been a big part of that. So that's been amazing. And then there's Community Reboot with Maria Egan over at Pulse. Also with Women's Audio Mission, which has been around for a very long time. Women in the Mix has been set up by the Recording Academy, Sound Girls, it's almost like like I say, it feels like a tidal wave of activity and support. At first I thought, oh, these hashtags are really cool.
Yeah.
And then I realized these are not just hashtags. These are women who are in, women and men. There's some kind of allies as well, setting up things to support, who are in really powerful positions. So it's not just like, oh, let's put a few women in the studio and make it look good. They are actually like setting up sessions that are paid and that are, records that are getting released. So it's not just sort of jumping on the bandwagon or talk. There's action, and it's very sort of professional projects. So it's just been amazing. I mean, there's a part of me that's still kind of pinching myself, and I feel very lucky that I've been here for a while. It's happening at a moment where I've kind of got my feet underneath me and can be of more use and more service to young people coming up.
That's terrific. Well, talking about coming up, we note that you're a graduate of LIPA, the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts in the UK, and that is where you and I first crossed paths.
It is. In probably 97 or 98.
It was 98, and probably I was teaching at LIPA.
Yes.
I was a guest lecturer, and I was there for 5 years, and that launched my academic career. The college was co-founded by Mark Featherstone Whitty and Sir Paul McCartney, not to drop a big name, but it was a really interesting environment. And at the time, because you were there very early in its evolution, as was I, things were. It was really the first. They used to call it Sir Paul's Fame School. The press liked to call it that because that was kind of their tag. How did you end up at LIPA?
I was writing songs in Ireland with, a friend in school. I was in a boarding school in my hometown in County Wicklow. And her father was a huge Beatles fan. Her name is Lenny Morrison, and she's actually an artist in her own right now. But her dad told her about the school, and she said, "Lynn, check it out. I know you're so into this, and you should apply." And she really encouraged me to kind of put an application together. And I didn't have a plan B or a sense of what I wanted to do. I just knew I was really interested in music, but particularly in the process of making music. I had a little 4-track and was experimenting with whatever technology I could get my hands on at the time. And so I applied, and I got a letter to say, unfortunately, we don't have a place for you, but based on your application, we'd love you to reapply next year. And I really, at that point, again, no plan B, and I got a job in a little photo kiosk in a train station where people would drop off their films to be developed in Dublin. And it was definitely like a sense of, I'm not really sure what to do now. And I got a phone call to say, we've been issued extra funding, 2 extra places have opened up on the sound tech course, and you were next on the list. Can you be here in a week? So the gods smiled upon me, and next thing I knew, I was at Paul McCartney's Fame School, watching Spinal Tap.
Oh yes, and you watched Spinal Tap, and you turned the amps up to 11.
Exactly. So next thing, I'm sitting in the auditorium watching Spinal Tap on my first night at college.
In the Paul McCartney Auditorium, as it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
A beautiful, beautiful venue. That school is very exclusive. I think at one point there were like 650 people auditioned for 35 slots, and it's interesting how the choices that they would make were not typical choices, too.
They weren't, and that was thankfully, I was very lucky that they don't make typical choices. I actually asked the head of the sound tech department at the end of my degree, because I definitely got there and realized that most of my peers had more experience in the studio. They'd either done a lot of live sound, or they had, they'd been in studios a lot more than I had. I was definitely coming in with just a sense of wanting to do, but not really understanding what's involved. And I asked John Thornton, the head of sound tech, at the end of the degree, how, I struggled a lot during this. How is it that you how come you gave me a place? And he said, it was the spark in your eye. He said, I can't teach that passion.
Oh, wow.
I can teach you everything else, but I can't teach what I saw, in your eyes in terms of your want to do this.
That's so interesting.
I, was so lucky. And I would say that's probably quite rare for that being a choice of giving an applicant a place in most schools or most things like that. So, yeah, thankfully,
nice.
Lucky for me, they were thinking outside the box.
It's interesting, sometimes people say, well, who came out of the school that became famous? And it's not really about fame. It's about who has a career in the industry. I mean, you certainly do. I mean, I think of Jesse Harlan, who, interestingly enough, hired Gordie Hobb, who's been on our show. And, so like these threads continue throughout our careers of people that we come up with.
And actually, some of those threads are continuing for me now. I've always wanted to, and I've watched Kate Havnovic.
Yes.
From Oslo. I kind of followed her, career along the way, and
Yes.
I've been a big fan of her music, and always had this yearn of, I'd love to write with Kate. And finally, we had an opportunity recently to get together, and we're kind of beginning that sort of exploration of working together. And then I just finished an album the other day, and sent it to Chris Sansom, who also lives in Oslo, who's an amazing mastering engineer.
That's great.
And Paul Bretland.
Yes,
and,
I know Paul.
So there are a pocket of students that I kept in touch with that I'm now starting to work with. So, and also, like you say, it's not so much these kind of, most of the alumni are more behind the scenes, so they are famous in their field, and like you say, they have great careers.
They do. Please give my regards to all of them. Kate was particularly, I remember her so well from class. She always sat in the back, but she was always very attentive to it. So
yeah, she's
just
fantastic.
Great to see
fantastic
these people.
Artist and a fantastic film composer as
It's
well.
amazing to see.
Yeah.
Well, now, don't we have a lot of love in the room?
Yes, we do.
Let's continue. You didn't wait to get your diploma to jump on in there, even while you were going to school. Now, you were starting to work really deeply within the industry in London, right?
Yeah, a friend of mine was working for Nellie Hooper, who produced Bjork's first album, which is monumental, amongst many others, no doubt, and Madonna, I think. But she invited me to come and assist at his, kind of be a fly on the wall at his studio. But she also recommended me as a trainee for a wonderful composer, Mark Thomas, Welsh composer who was doing a BBC drama at the time. And so I got to spend, I think, the bones of 6 months going back and forth to London and also Ireland as his trainee composer. So that was a wonderful experience. I think that was in the third year, the year before I graduated. So yeah, it was amazing to sort of already start to get a look into what it's like to work in the industry.
So I remember having a student who apologized. He said, I have to miss class because I'm going to London for an audition. I'm like, well, that's the point of the school, is that you go to London for auditions. So it's interesting how the industry is very aware of those situations as well.
And I had full support from Lip and from John Thornton to take the opportunity and do it. He allowed me to extend things a little bit so I could keep everything going. So yeah.
Wow. So it's that spark you've got, huh? You still have that spark for sure.
I hope so. I still feel actually, I would say I feel more passionate now than I did in the beginning.
Yeah.
Especially in the last couple of years, I feel like I became more of a student again. I wasn't the best student when I was there, and I feel like something shifted in the last kind of maybe 7 years where I just started to study and learn again, and now I just look at everything as practice and learning, and it's a nice feeling to have.
Yes, indeed. I was put together a little playlist. I was listening to things that you had worked on musically. So I wanted to talk about some of the artists that you've been engaged with and some of the situations. And again, Larry Klein is a producer who you worked with a lot in Los Angeles. Yes. Larry, he's been our guest on Stereophonic. He speaks very highly of you, of course, and that's a terrific thing. But K.D. Lang is an artist that you had occasion to work with, and very successfully, and it was kind of a shift in what she was doing at that time, and you seem to fit into whatever that model was. Can you talk a little bit about Ms. Lang?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was actually talking to somebody the other day about that I think, the impact that she had on the way I look at recording and kind of the whole process and production, and I was very shaped and informed by my experience working with her. We were working together with sort of a kids camp, and it was a program called Tools for Peace that was set up by our Buddhist teacher, Lama Gyatso. And so we had a relationship outside of music, kind of working on this camp. And I think it was the first time she saw me operate Pro Tools, and she knew what I did, but it was the first time she saw me kind of working. And she came to me and said, I've got this album I've been writing. I've just been writing it in my art kitchen. She used to have a space where she painted. And they're songwriting demos, but I really want to maintain as much as possible the essence of these demos. So I don't really want to sort of go to a producer and see how to produce these songs. I'd like to just delve in and see what's there and then see what's needed from there. And so I'd love to work with you on that. And it was just the most incredible experience to spend, I think it was 9 or 10 months in a very small little room going through these demos and just really looking for the essence of the song. I believe it was the first time she self-produced. So to see her work through that and to see what she was looking for and what she was responding to, and we would work on the tracks a little bit and then she would go in to sing, and it almost felt like if she found an in of how to sing it, then she knew the track was right. If she didn't, then she was like, no, we'll shape this a little bit more. So to just see what her gauge was, and it just was all boiled down to finding the essence and maintaining the essence of the song and letting that be first and foremost. And that's a resounding theme. Most of the great producers that I love, that's what they're looking for, because that's really what moves people at the end of the day.
What producers did you look to as you were coming up and kind of observe?
I mean, certainly Larry's work. I was definitely very aware of his work, and Larry Klein. And then T-Bone Burnett is a huge, huge influence for me. Earlier on, back in the day, actually, Nelly Hooper was, because I was a lot more engaged in electronic music. But I think what he did with that was way more expanded. It wasn't one-dimensional, just electronica beats. He really seemed to be able to marry organic and electronic elements. I think when I started at Lip, I don't think I even knew what a producer was. One of the questions on the questionnaire was, who's your favorite producer? And I really didn't actually know what that was. So and to this day, I think it's something that people don't necessarily understand what a producer does. And there are different types of producers, different styles of producers.
That's for sure. Our friend Greg Wells, who we interviewed, who did The Greatest Showman, he thinks that the term is inappropriate. He thinks it should be called like director of music. He said, because if you look at a film, you know what a director does. But if you look at a record, you don't necessarily know what a producer does, as you say. You know?
And also people ask, is it like the producer of a film? And it's like, no, it is more like the director. So that's actually a great way to look at it.
I think that's really interesting. I remember Nick Lowe telling me, being a producer for him, wearing a nice suit and standing in the back of the studio. Because there are producers that simply will set up a situation and then allow that to be.
And that's an art in itself.
It is. Yeah. Getting the right people in the right chemistry and then just getting that moment.
Yeah, Joe Henry is someone that springs to mind like that. He's just, he has such a skill of knowing who to put in the room and then really letting them be themselves. And I resonate more with that as a producer than maybe someone who has a very set sound in mind and, they kind of want the players to play a certain way. To me, it's like everybody in the room should be allowed to be themselves because you're looking for their reaction and their response to the music, and I want that first. And if it's not the right thing for the artist or for the direction, then you can start crafting something else. But you will never get that first reaction back. I'll often say to independent artists when I'm putting the team together and I'm hiring the musicians for them, I'll say, okay, the first 2, maybe 3 takes, we're not gonna say anything. I want to hear what they have to do, what their reaction to reaction to it is first, because we will never get back to that. The minute we say anything, even one comment, it takes them out of their right brain and puts them into thinking mode, and you won't get back there again.
Wow. Very interesting. To backtrack a little on your story, because I think this is an interesting element of your story, is sort of the way that you got to the U.S. was actually through a little conceptual movement to Brazil.
Yes. A lot of my Brazilian friends call me an honorary Brazilian now.
That's great.
So, I through some mutual friends, I was introduced to the music of Airto Moreira and Flora Purim and their children, Diana Booker and Krishna Booker. Their kids at the time were doing kind of trip hop, which when I was in the UK, I was very into, trip hop and drum and bass and electronica. So I heard their record, and it almost, thinking about it now, it was like the Pied Piper just calling you. It was like the music just called me. I was like, what is this sound? Like, what is it, and where does this come from? And interestingly enough, it came from the fact that these, when I say kids, they're the same age as me, but that these, guys had grown up with these jazz legends and these Brazilian musicians surrounded by them. And so they were super into hip hop and trip hop. And so somehow the osmosis of all of that jazz and Brazilian music snuck into their productions. So it was so unique to hear these blends of styles, and it felt very authentic. You could tell it wasn't somebody went, let's put a samba beat on a trip hop track, which happens, and
sure,
it doesn't have the same feeling as that natural ability that they had to understand those genres of music and be able to put them together. So I was really moved by them musically, and then I got to meet them around the same time we met, around 96 or 97, on visits to the States. And coming up to graduation, they sort of said, it'd be great to have you here, and maybe we could sponsor your visa. And I remember Flora approaching Airto and kind of saying, I'd like us to sponsor Lynne's visa. And he said, well, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? And she said, it's like what Cannonball Adderley did for us. And he just went, yep, done. Let's do it. So they had somebody who had sponsored them to move to the States. So I always thought, thank you, Cannonball Adderley.
That's interesting.
They were paying it forward, essentially.
Yeah. Cannonball Adderley. That's an amazing point of reference. Mm. Yeah, I know his widow, Olga Adderley, and wonderful people. And the legacy of Cannonball Adderley, through Nate Adderley, his son. I mean, there's a lot of musical threads we can follow from that. You worked with the jazz folks. You worked with Wayne Shorter, right?
I did. I did get the opportunity to record Wayne, which was just magical, doesn't describe it. And it was through Larry. It was him and Larry and Wayne are very good friends and have worked together a lot. So, but I had also met Wayne through Airto and Flora as well when I first moved here. So Wayne and Herbie Hancock are very much a part of their kind of family in a way. But yeah, to get to record that kind of, he's just a magical being who's kind of, it feels like he's connected to something else and just pulling it down and bringing it into this world for us to hear, So
that's very interesting. I noticed, Diana Reeves that you worked with. I mean, just different people from that particular world.
Yes.
Which is, a legacy which is connected to kind of a whole other thing. I mean, pop music is a wonderful thing too. I mean, I know you work all the way across the board, but it's great to have those kind of roots, I think.
And I think that just thinking about it now, talking to you, I think that one of the differences is the improv factor. It's like jazz musicians in general, improvisation is a huge part of what they do. There's structure, but then within that structure, you improvise. And it takes a lot of bravery to leap off that cliff and just go and not necessarily know what's going to come out, but to trust your facility, to trust your practice. You can't do that if you haven't practiced, maybe your instrument. So it's like that trust of like, okay, I'm going to just let go and see what happens. So I think maybe that may be one of the differences in that genre of the improvisation factor is, it happens obviously more in the pop world if there's a solo, but
sure.
You don't really hear solos very much in pop music. So,
no.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if the improv factor really requires you to, I think about and talk about the left and the right brain a lot, and it really requires you to be fully in your right brain to be able to improvise like that.
Which part of the brain works for you?
I'm starting to learn, and I keep delving into it. The left brain is useful for, okay, that's hot. You might want to take your hand out of the fire. But it's not useful for, oh, do you really think that's good? I mean, who are you to think that you could do this? Or it's that noise. The critic is not useful. So I try to really kind of keep that extracurricular noise of good enough or is it good enough, especially out of the writing and creative process.
Yeah.
Because the right side is so much more useful. It's just sort of connected and open and unafraid. And so I think they're both useful, but I tend to be very much more right-brained.
Yeah, I think you're in good company.
Yeah, I think so too.
Producers generally have a time period in which we are aware of them more. And then sometimes they become identified with a certain sound, and then times move on, and then they may be, in a perception way, less relevant to what's going on now. A producer that you've worked with who has really been able to stretch beyond that is Rick Knowles. To me, he comes to mind, and there are other producers like that. But why do you think that time limitation is put on producers? Or do you think that?
That's a really good question. We've spoken about, like Larry and T-Bone and stuff. They are continuing to blaze forward with really fresh records. And so I'm wondering, it's more of a question. It's like, I wonder if it's when somebody stays engaged in what they're doing, is open, is learning, is growing as a person and as a creator, then maybe that's when you stay more relevant.
Yeah.
Maybe if somebody is more closed and they kind of, it's the comfort zone, okay, I know this is going to work, and they just do what they have always done and maybe don't try to break out of certain defaults, then maybe that's when they don't sort of progress with as time moves and are not seen as relevant. So I wonder if that relevancy comes from, is that a word?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. It comes from that openness and that willingness to be a perpetual student.
And when you think about Klein, who reads a great deal, he's very...
Absolutely,
he's very literate. And we've been to his home, so we've seen like that evidence, which is interesting. So I agree with you. I think that's good. Within the musical parameters, and because we live in Los Angeles, there's places for everything.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And I think that's one of the wonderful things about the world that we operate in now is that there's not any one specific musical dynamic, but there are many niches which people are listening to.
And I think it's that thing of when you decide what feels good to you, and that's the sort of path. And we talked about this. For me, I'm starting to understand what it is that moves me and what I feel makes great music, and that's what I'm gravitating towards. And for somebody else, it might be different, and there will be an audience for that different thing that they do. There's no competition. It's more like, okay, I'm just going to try to be the best of what I can do and really try to show up and be present in whatever project I'm working on. When I finish a project, if I feel like I've been present, that's when I feel like, okay, you did a good job. If I feel like I was checked out in any way, then that's when I go, okay, you need to step up your game. So, yeah.
We'll be right back after this. At Stereophonic, we are obsessed with great sound. Every episode of our podcast is edited and mixed using the software plugins created by iZotope, the secret weapon of professionals around the world that inspire and enable creativity, save time, increase productivity, and deliver professional sounding results. To find out more, visit iZotope.com. That's spelled IZOTOPE. And now, back to our podcast. You have a studio. It's a wonderful studio. I've been to your studio. It's very
It's lovely to have you there.
I remember the perception of the only thing I said, the only thing you're missing is a dog. You go, oh, there are no other dogs in the house.
Let me let them out. Let me let the dogs out. Abby and Stella, come say hi.
Yeah, I have to have dogs in the studio. But it's a very wonderful environment. I remember how organic it feels to be in that room.
Thank you. I'm glad that translates, because that it was very purposeful or strategic to just... After many years of being in different studios, I just paying attention to what I felt, what works, what doesn't, what supports, people being able to feel comfortable and open, because that's what you're looking for. Yeah. So I think I thought about that a lot, of like what disarms people. So I'm kind of a little bit manipulative almost. It's like what makes people feel relaxed and comfortable, and that's how I designed the space in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, it was already built. It was built by the drummer from White Zombie.
Oh, I could feel that.
Oh, absolutely. But it was very well soundproofed because he was in a neighborhood trying not to disturb his neighbors. So I was very lucky in that sense that it was that well built. But I just feel when people are comfortable, they can relax. And also somebody pointed out to me the other day, the budgets have obviously shifted.
Yeah.
Things are, you have to be able to do things in it with, less amount of time. So you need people to be able to get comfortable very quickly. Like sometimes they might only have the day and they need to walk in and get into that headspace immediately. And so I'm very aware of that. And it's like, okay, how quickly can I help and facilitate them getting there? So some of it was related to that. You can't kind of spend months in the studio together. So it's all about how quickly can you get people to relax.
That is so interesting, Lynne. I've never heard anybody with that perception before. That's fascinating.
It's about people at the end of the day. It's like, yes, it's about music, but it's people making music. So as a kid, I was very interested in psychology, and that probably would have been something I may have pursued. I get to do both every day. I just happen to have a qualification in one. But it's people, and
Sure.
we're dealing with emotion, you're dealing with reactions, you're dealing with sort of defense mechanisms, with all of these things. And so having an understanding of that, because that's the real dance that's happening in the studio. So that's the way I look at it.
You have a solid community of players around you, I know, that you use on different projects. And last Saturday, I went to a concert. Our producer, Lindsay Tomasic, has a record release, songs from the sixth floor. And Mark Goldenberg was on guitar.
Oh,
He was
fantastic.
a magical player. I've heard him on record, of course, but I had never seen him perform, to my knowledge, live. And he
He is
was
amazing.
just so appropriate and tuned into what was going on. So I think about him, Jennifer Condos, Jay Bellerose, people that are members of your community. And,
Absolutely, yeah. I was very fortunate to be introduced. They had been my neighbors, both Mark and Jennifer and Jay, for many years, and I didn't know. And Greg Lees, who played with Katie Lang for many years, amongst many others, he introduced us. He said, I want to do a session, and actually it's great because I want you to meet your neighbors. We did a session with an artist called Shannon McNally.
Yeah.
And it was all live, everyone in the same room, no isolation, just they were, intended to just be song demos. And it was just the most magical, thing to watch those guys, play. But you mentioned it's about their presence and engagement, and it's about, I feel like the players that I love to work with most, that's why, is that they're just very tuned in, and their whole goal is, how can we serve this song? Jay's one of the only drummers that's ever asked me for a lyric sheet, their primary focus is the melody, the lyric, the artist, the song. Like, that's what they're serving, as opposed to the opposite, which is someone who's just listening to themselves. They're listeners. That's what makes a fantastic session player.
And they all play at once or on certain projects, right? You have everybody playing at the same time.
Yeah, and that was the other kind of reason I really wanted to have my own place that could facilitate, because it's enough to have 4 or 5 players play live with their own headphone cues and things, and that was the purpose of that, was knowing that people still really wanted to make live records but couldn't necessarily always afford to go to Capitol or Henson or the Village. So I wanted to make my place as live capable as possible. So a lot of the projects that have come through there over the last 10 years have been live recordings.
What are you working on right now?
I just finished, literally in the last day or two, I have had the beautiful opportunity to work with an Irish artist called Moya Brennan, who was in a very famous Irish band called Clannad.
Sure, of course.
Enya's sister,
Yes, uh-huh.
Enya's family. So Moya Brennan and my good friend Cormac DeBarra, who's an Irish harp player. So I got to write 7 or 8 of the songs on the album with them. So we co-wrote a lot of it, and Moya traveled out to LA to work on it with us. She heard work that Cormac and I were doing together. We produce music and write music together, and she said, "Okay, I really want to explore the style that you guys are doing." So she came out to LA a few times for us to write and record, and so I just finished that in the last couple of days, and I'm so excited about it. It was so nice to work on, finally, after 20 years of living in LA, to work on an Irish album. And I always wanted to bridge back. I always felt like I want to come to LA and then I want to bridge back to Ireland and, you know, work between the two places. And you know, so it's starting to happen, which is very exciting.
Cool. And you were in Ireland for the AES convention. Was that recently?
Yes, that was in March.
Oh, how was that?
It was fantastic. It was nice to have an excuse to go home, and the first time I've done anything in Ireland in the industry in a way. So it was great to go and do that.
We think about the musical contributions of Ireland. I mean, considering the size of Ireland in terms of its influence, which is huge, especially in American music. I mean, world music in general. And I think beyond that, kind of a deeper spiritual connection. I mean, a writer one time talked to me about an Irish phrase called the thin places, the places between the conscious world and the unconscious world. And I thought that was a really interesting concept.
Wow, that is. I actually haven't heard that, but it makes me think of Leonard Cohen. I mean, he talks about that, the veil between the worlds being thin and things, you know. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, and Leonard was certainly on that line.
Yeah.
You know, so did you work with Leonard? Did you have an opportunity to work with Leonard?
I had an opportunity, not directly with Leonard, I had an opportunity to work with Adam, his son,
Yes,
Adam Cohen,
yes.
on a few occasions, who's just a wonderful human being. And obviously Leonard and KD have a connection as well. So yeah, I did get to meet him once or twice, and his vibe was just so amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people would be surprised how funny he was. And Klein and I talked about that as well. Leonard was a very, very funny man, you know.
Yeah.
He was aware of being a Leonard Cohen. That was part of the gig.
But very humble.
Yes, true.
Very, very humble.
You're humble, you know. Did you go back to Ireland? You didn't go back and like all diva up with a stylist, did you?
It's just, yeah, no, I did not know. No. I think after many years of being in the studio too, it's like you're so focused on the work. I think since living here, I don't feel like I've been in the music business up until now. I feel like it's all been serendipity and you know, sort of coincidence and connections, you know, through sort of almost like what I consider my chosen family. So, and I don't know that I'd have lasted this long here if it felt kind of cold and sort of unconnected in that way. And now I'm sort of more involved in the music business in a sense, you know, through the Recording Academy and stuff. And I'm meeting the most amazing people who are super engaged and connected. And so I just feel like I've had a little bit of a unique experience in some ways. I talked to some of the girls who came up more in the pop world, and they definitely had more horror stories of just dynamics and issues that they had to deal with. And it made me realize, wow, you kind of sideswiped a lot of that. And some of that may have come from being more, you know, working in more eclectic genres, working in more world music and not really working in the pop world.
Sure.
So it's making me now realize, you know, I've been very lucky in that sense, that I haven't had to deal with some of those things. And but also things are changing. I feel like the industry's very, very different to how it used to be. So
I think it's a lot more open.
I think so too.
Yeah, I was reading about the thing you did at the Recording Academy with Linda Perry, and Malay was one of the producers that was involved in that.
Yes,
yeah,
that was on Saturday. That was the most incredible experience.
Yeah, Malay is very interesting. I've interviewed him before, and of course Harvey Mason Jr. was there. We've interviewed, and you know,
Ed Cherney
we've interviewed. Ed had a great quote, like "Nobody leaves dancing to the gear."
That struck me. That was the most amazing thing. That was the quote of the day.
That's so
for
Ed
sure.
Cherney.
It was called Follow the Song, and they had a song demo from Evan Bogart and some co-writers, and 3 different rooms, 3 different producers, 3 different mixers. There wasn't really an engineer because 2 of the productions were quite track-based. I think Harvey and Malay did their own thing. Linda had an assistant engineer with her. So it wasn't really tracking per se. So I say producers and mixers, and mastering. Michelle Mancini mastered at the end. But I think the resounding theme on the panel, I you know, I had a list of questions, and some of them were about the technology and the gear. And my instincts just said, what we're talking about here is, again, essence and finding that essence, and that's what's most important. Yes, there are tips and tricks, and it's good to share those and have some techie, geeky conversations too. But ultimately, what all 3 of the producers talked about was, you know, was sort of finding that essence, and that you're really, again, serving the song. That's what's going to move people, you know, and that's also what's going to hold the artist up. In this case, there wasn't an artist because it was sort of a demo. So it seemed the theme was all the things we've been talking about today. And it was so nice because they are very much in the pop world, a lot of those producers, but it was so nice to see that's what they're keyed in on as well. And maybe it's not so different, so maybe it's not genre specific. I mean, watching Linda work, I was sitting in the room. It's the first time I've had an opportunity to just kind of see her. I mean, we don't get to see each other work often, unless you're a session player. But I got to sit in the room while she said, I have to find this song for myself. So it's a little bit sweet. It's, I have to sit down now on the whirly and kind of figure out how I feel it and how I would convey it. She was essentially acting as the artist as well as the producer. And I went in to take a couple of photographs, and I was just sitting in the room with her in the whirly, and it was so raw and so vulnerable and so just she was telling the room, you have to be willing to go there. Like, I have to be willing to just sit here and come out with whatever. And it might be terrible at first, but then those one or two good things. So her version of the song was completely stripped down, whirly vocal, pump organ, and a little atmospheric guitar. And it was so captivating. Like, it was just so raw. And kind of getting to look into that's what she goes for. That's what her ethos is as well. It was like, wow, we're quite alike in that way, So it's nice to see these people more in the pop side of things, not even the pop, but the more that side of the industry, and that they feel the same way as I do. It was a relief for me in some ways. What I do and what I like is not then restricted to any genre. Yeah. So...
You mentioned with Linda Perry, you had gone into the room to do photography. And photography is also something else that you do. You've done a wonderful series of people, mainly in studio situations. And I know that you compare sometimes the moment of photography to the moment of music as well. How does that work?
Yeah, they're very similar. I find we had some really good conversations about this. And that kind of came from KD. Like, at one point she said that to me. She's like, it's like a photograph. You're capturing a moment in time. It's called a record. It's a record of a moment in time. It's a record of what happened in that room. We don't often think about it that way. We say record, we think of a disc or a vinyl or an MP3, but in her mind, it's a record of a moment in time. So, and that's what a photograph is. You're kind of candidly capturing a moment. So, in the years in the studio, I always kept my camera beside me, and I love photographing musicians working. Yeah. And so, and through that experience, it's forced me to have to learn and figure out how to work with light in the same way I've figured out how to work with sound, because it's the same thing in some ways. And then I had a funny realization the other day. I finally got invested in a better camera and a lens, and I went, oh no, lenses are like microphones. I'm going to want a ton of lenses now. But at the same time, that's not true, because it's not, you don't need a lot to create. You find those very specific go-to things that you can get the results from. But I did have that moment of, oh, lenses are like microphones. So
thank God they're not like guitars. We'd have a number of those.
Yes, we have quite a few guitars.
We're surrounded
right
by
now.
A bunch of guitars. Great. Lynne Earls, is there an artist that you would like to work with whom you have never been behind the board? Is there somebody very special that you would like to put out there?
I thought about that the other day. Somebody asked me about that, and not weirdly enough, but Pink.
Pink.
There is something about her as as an artist and as a person, and and Sia. Mm-hmm. They're just, and it's nice to feel that, because I've worked more in eclectic genres, that I have this yearn to kind of like, I see these women in the pop world and go like, you guys are amazing, and I wonder if that's kind of like seeing what you can tap into when it's brought a little bit out of that world to some degree. So yeah, Pink and Sia come to mind for some reason.
Good. Here's another stereophonic question for you. The time I met you, you were like a teenager. Obviously you have a lot of experience then. What would you tell your 18-year-old self?
Just be you. Just be you. Like, just kind of be the best you can possibly be, instead of putting that energy into, is it okay? And, what will people think? And yeah, it's like, just be you and be kinder to yourself.
Be kinder. Good. Stereophonic question. Again, you mentioned earlier in the interview that if you were not doing music, you would probably be a psychologist, right? What would be your specific area of treatment if you were a psychologist?
Probably working with creatives and kind of helping them unblock the obstacles that get in the way, the mental obstacles that get in the way creatively, and that realization that usually it is our own. We're very good at getting in our own ways. And it's nice to sort of unravel how do you get out of your own way. So probably working with creatives, yeah.
Lynne Earls, you're a fascinating subject. Great to talk to you. Before we go, I understand that you've recently begun dancing the tango. Now, how do you put together, what are the similarities between the tango, the music, the photography, and your overall philosophy?
Wow, there's a lot of crossover. 3 years ago, I was introduced to tango by a friend, and I started taking classes, and was immediately just pulled in and became an addict very quickly. There are so many metaphors in tango for life, for relationship, and also for music. It really boils down to it requires you to be fully engaged and present in your own body with your partner, because it's a partner dance.
Sure.
It's social tango I do, not so much what you see on Dancing with the Stars. So it's all improv. So yes, there's a vocabulary, and there are understood moves, but ultimately you're improvising them. So you have to be so present in your own body, your partner, the music, and then if you're leading, the room itself, the dance floor itself. So it just requires so much of you. And I find that to be so helpful. It's like it gives me a language of how to think about, we talked a lot today in the podcast about presence and engagement. It's like it's given me that language to understand what makes something feel really good, So I now lead and follow, but initially I started more as a leader. Mm-hmm. And I find that that's affected me as a producer. To really think about, because essentially in the studio in those moments, the producer's the leader, but it's made me think about what makes a great leader. And lately it's really coming to my attention, it's about being a great listener. If you're not listening as a leader to the music or to your partner's body and body mechanics, it doesn't feel good to follow that. The leaders in tango that stand out are the ones that are just super tuned in to the music and to the follower and to the room. And so it's just given me this understanding of what makes a good leader, what makes a good follower. It's also shifting how I feel about making music when I'm writing now, because tango music, it's from the 20s to the 50s. There's no drums, but it's super rhythmic, and all the rhythm is coming from the bandoneon, which is like an accordion, the piano, the strings, and it's all about conversation within the music. It's all kind of like call and response, and there's a lot of dynamic and space and things that it makes it exciting to dance to. So when I write now, I'll actually go out into the room. If I don't have the melody yet, I'll go out into the room and move a little bit and see where my body wants to move. And that will inform where maybe I might end up writing the melody, because as a dancer, I tend to dance more to the melody. So it's just become very integrated in how I make music. And again, the improv factor opens you up and makes you less afraid to try something.
Wow, you've inspired me to put a rose between my teeth and begin dancing.
I haven't had the rose yet. I'm waiting for that to happen.
Lynne Earls, so much to talk about, so much to absorb, and so much to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What a pleasure to chat to you.
It's been great being with you on
So
Stereophonic.
nice to catch up. Thank you.
This episode of Stereophonic was produced and edited by Lindsay Tomasic.
Du